What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Sleep Awake, a psychological horror game that I would say is honestly mostly a walking simulator, set in an, I would say, interesting universe with some certainly unique visuals going on. However, to just get the important part out of the way, this game is probably way too expensive for what it is. It's about $30 US, and the 100% on this took me about 5 hours. It is extremely short, and to that end, while I do usually 100% a lot of games for reviews, in this particular case that's just not a very impressive thing, as really outside of the story there's just a couple of collectibles and some odds and ends to find, making that an extremely easy process. With that in mind, this game did release yesterday, the 2nd of December. I did in fact pay for it, no review copy here, and it must be said that I simply don't feel that I got my money's worth out of this one. However, the story and the visuals are certainly interesting, but probably nothing to really write home about either, with probably the more interesting thing about it being really like the sort of psychedelic visual effects they're constantly doing. With that in mind, as we move forward here, this game's hard to cover without spoiling something because it is so inherently very short, so keep that in mind as we move through this, but otherwise let's get going here, kicking it off first with the technical state of this one. Luckily, in its relatively short runtime, I did not run into any problems to speak of, haven't seen anybody else report anything over on the Steam forums, and honestly, just given its very short runtime, I would have been more surprised if there was an issue. Otherwise, let's get into the description of some of what we've got in store here. So, Sleep Awake puts us in the role of a young woman named Katya, who is at a bit of a crossroads with a dire situation plaguing what is the last city on Earth. By and large, the world seems to have ended some time ago, with this final city being left after everyone else succumbed to what is being called the hush. Basically, if people fall asleep, they simply disappear, sometimes leaving behind echoes known as void shadows that you can potentially look into to see their final moments, but otherwise they're kind of just gone without a trace. To avoid this fate, people were doing crazier and crazier things to try to stave off sleep for as long as possible. In the case of Katya and her family's case, they were taking these herbal infusions designed to sort of force them awake. When it becomes pretty clear that you're quickly running out of supplies and time, things like that, while also trying to take care of the few people you know are still okay in the world, things start to close in around you pretty fast, and you have to very obviously figure out something else. Now, along the way, we're going to, of course, hit a few obstacles, but by and large, this is a relatively linear walking simulator type of game. The vast majority of the game is walking or running slightly fast to the next destination as you kind of see things along the way. Now, that is occasionally broken up with bits of more involved gameplay, such as running from the various factions you'll find yourself up against, namely the DTM, or the Delta Transmission Ministry. These are effectively like a death cult. However, they are paired with other factions across the town, known as the Machinists or the Pain Eaters, each of which represents kind of a different way people have chosen to try to stay awake in this post-apocalypse, each thinking, of course, that theirs is the one true way. Now, outside of generally trying to avoid these guys, we're also going to have the occasional puzzle or slightly creepier encounters, as your deeply sleep-deprived state would have you hallucinate, perhaps, let's say, but that's kind of another aspect of it. The very sleep-deprived nature of everything you're going through leaves what you are seeing to be very unreliable in terms of, whether or not it's actually there. But at most, you're going to be sneaking through the occasional area riddled with a few different enemies that can kill you pretty easily, at which point you'll sort of just respawn via this sort of weird dream sequence loading screen that pops you back into where you were via the game's checkpoint system, and otherwise, there's not too much to see outside of sneaking past these enemies. There are a handful of collectibles, these being things that you have to pick up, like the tapes, which sort of explain a little bit of what's going on here and what's been happening, why your father went missing, stuff like that. The microfiche films, which will give you a more dedicated background on things that have actually happened, provided you can find a reader to put them into, but these can give you all sorts of information that led up to the state of the world being what it is. And then finally, the void shadows. These are mostly just lore. They can, again, as I mentioned, kind of retell you the last moments of someone who succumbed to the hush. And while it's hardly an, especially deep experience given just the very short nature of it and everything, what I can say is that they do a lot with the environment. It is very interesting to see this sort of dilapidated city that's very clearly on its last legs as people are fighting for what little remains of their survival. Along the way, you're going to get a front row view to the various things they were doing to try to keep themselves awake, because the herbal infusions that your family were using are honestly kind of tame in comparison to everything else that was going on here. However, while all of that is well and good, I would say my other main criticism is that, probably by design, it's just kind of hard to follow what actually went on here. Like, you can sort of get the gist of it up until a point, but the last couple chapters of the game's 13-chapter relatively linear structure are very heavy on the psychedelic part, meaning that it's kind of hard to parse the specifics of what happened, and I imagine with games like this that may very well be intentional in order to leave that sort of vague and up to interpretation, but the issue is that doesn't exactly lead to the most satisfying conclusion, and mostly it just kind of left me feeling a bit underwhelmed on that front. And I guess that would describe most of my experience with this game, is simply that for the price I paid and the experience I got, I was just a little underwhelmed. Now, before we start wrapping this up, let's talk a bit about the Steam Deck. So this game is verified on the Steam Deck, a very simple game, obviously plays perfectly okay over there. It does have controller support, which in the case of this game is probably the biggest thing to note, but otherwise, let's keep it moving and talk about positives, negatives, and wrap this thing up, as this is a short game, which makes for a short and sweet review. But on the positive side of things, I really enjoyed the atmosphere in particular. I enjoyed walking around this place. It is appropriately creepy. I like a lot of what they did with the visuals and the sort of psychedelic effects they added on to everything to make it feel especially sort of trippy. And I liked the general premise, even if the conclusion was a bit underwhelming. But let's switch it over to the negatives here. So on the negative side, this game is way shorter than I thought it would be. I don't really expect these kinds of games to be long, but if you're not trying to 100% this, I'd be surprised if it took you more than 3 or 4 hours. And on top of that, even as short as it is, making this less of a concern, it also lacks some little quality of life improvements. For instance, you can't really skip the cutscenes or anything, and this game has a substantial amount of them. If you're trying to 100% the game, you cannot re-tackle the specific sections you're missing. And again, the game is short enough that isn't a huge deal by any means. And then on top of that, the overall ending for this one was, again, underwhelming. So that ultimately brings me to my conclusion. This game is $30 US, and for that price, simply put, I just don't think the experience is quite there. It would have to be significantly lower for me to feel okay with that, in the $10 to $15 range at most would be where I would call it. And so, all told, while this game is certainly doing some unique things in terms of stuff like its visuals and everything, it's just not a game I would be happy to recommend except on the deepest of sales. But if you can find it for pretty cheap, I think as an atmospheric narrative title, it's got some interesting stuff going on, but ultimately just doesn't quite land for me, which is where I'm going to leave off this particular review. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about this one down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.